Walk to the back. Awesome. All right. Well, hey, we're starting something new this morning. So it is not quite Lent, but it will be in like a couple of days. And Lent is the season leading up to Easter. So in the calendar of the church year, there are two seasons where we, if we had paraments, they would be purple, where we reflect. It's a more reflective or introspective season. So those are Lent and Advent. They're the seasons leading up to Easter and Christmas, respectively. And so we're coming up on Lent. Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. That's the first day of Lent. If you're familiar with church tradition, some people put ash on their forehead or on their hand or something. Christy will talk more about how we'll celebrate that or remember that this year. But so we're beginning Lent, and today we're gonna start our preaching series that aligns with our Lenten theme. And what we're gonna do this year is, I keep having to go really slow when I explain this. Each Sunday, we will talk about one day of Holy Week. Okay, so Holy Week is from Sunday to Sunday, right before Easter. It's the week that Jesus and his disciples were in Jerusalem, leading up to Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And so today, we're actually going to talk about Jesus' entry into the city, entry into Jerusalem, which is Sunday of that week. Next week, we'll talk about Monday of that week. The following week, we'll talk about Tuesday of that week. We might skip Wednesday because there's no scriptural narrative for Wednesday, but we'll talk about that when we get there, okay? So that's what we're going to do. But first, I have a question for you. Have you ever had to do something that was hard but good? Anybody? Yes? Yes? Yes or no? Just give me a yes or no first. Yes. Okay, great. Can I get a couple of examples? What's something you've done that was hard but good? Go ahead, Lily. Learning Japanese. That was hard but good. Yeah. Childbirth. Yes. So this was what came to my mind first. I was like, I didn't experience it, but I was there, and that seemed hard but good. Yeah. Say it again. Parenting. Hard but good. What else? Taking care of a sick parent. Hard but good. Huh? Walk across Florida. Corey has walked across Florida how many times? 2 3/4. Sounds about right. Just the final detail. You didn't want to get that part done. Yeah.
Homeschooling my children.
Homeschooling, yes. Hard but good. Forgiving. Michelle went right to the heart, guys. All right. That's good. Anybody else?
Putting an animal down.
Oh, putting an animal down. Yeah, hard but good. Yeah. Okay, so hard but good, right? One time after college, I did international mission work for a couple of years. This is actually where Aaron and I met, was doing that work. I don't know if I've told this story before. Probably I have, and then after today, Christy will remind me not to tell it again. Because generally I say, have I told this story? Yes, don't tell that story again. Yes, kill your darlings, that's the phrase, but that seems grotesque. So we were in Kenya, and we were doing ministry. There was like a guy who was sort of like an unofficial bishop of this area we were in. And it was we were in a town called Lodwar, which is like a capital of like this, like a hub of this desert region. And so this guy who was this unofficial bishop, we were 7 American missionaries. Actually, there was probably more than one. There might have been 14 of us. So he would sort of loan us out to the day to other pastors around to help them in their ministry. Usually that meant preaching or doing house-to-house ministry, because when the Americans are in town in the desert in Kenya, it's a big deal. Okay? And so there was multiple days in a row where we were doing house-to-house ministry in the desert. And so, but that meant that what we were doing is we were walking like a quarter mile or so between these stick huts where people lived with their goats and their family. And we would just say, hello, like we had a translator, and then we would talk to them about Jesus for a while through the translator, and then we'd move on, and then we'd pray with them, and then we'd move on to the next house. And about the second or third day of this, I was like, I don't want to walk through the desert again today. And I remember thinking, gosh, this is hard, right? And then it was partway through that day that I started to realize, like, oh, when you dream about doing international missions, this is what you dream about. It's like, I'm walking through the desert talking about Jesus with people who might have no idea who he is. In the end, it was a wild story. There was the day that I was most frustrated, there was a woman who said, there were some people just out tending their goats, and so they sat down, and my friend shared the gospel with them through a translator, and then the translator asked if anybody wanted to say anything, and this old woman stood up, and this whole region where they keep animals and rely on rain had been in a drought for 2 years. And she stands up and she says, we've been in this drought for 2 years. I was really worried. Last night I prayed to God to send a sign that everything was going to be okay. And today you all showed up from America and you are my sign that God is with us. And I was like, all right, I guess I can't pout about walking through the desert anymore, right? Hard but good. I don't want to be here, and at the same time, there's nowhere else I'd rather be but here doing this, right? And yeah, I think about sitting next to Aaron going through childbirth. This is a really, really hard place to be, but there's nowhere else I'd rather be, right? And so we've all had those. And I think that's a good place to begin as we think about what was the experience of Jesus in the week leading up to his crucifixion and resurrection. Here's the story in Mark chapter 11. It says, as they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you doing this, tell him, the Lord needs it and will send it back here shortly. They went and found a colt in the street, tied at a doorway, and they untied it. Some people standing there asked, what are you doing untying that colt? They answered as Jesus had told them to, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. So this is where the story of Holy Week begins. It begins in Jesus being hailed as a king. You might say, why was there a donkey and why did he have to borrow one and all this? There's lots of Old Testament prophecy, or some Old Testament prophecy, that says that the Messiah will come riding a donkey, a foal, the colt of a donkey or something, whatever the language is there, right? So he's fulfilling prophecy by entering into the town this way. And what strikes me is, I'll admit to you that for most of my growing up years, I would read this passage and I thought, wow, what a coincidence there was a donkey there, ready for them to use. And then I was listening to a guy teach about this a couple years ago, and he was like, so Jesus laid out all the details ahead of time. I was like, oh yeah, I knew that. He made a plan, right? So Jesus had spoken to somebody probably who spoke to somebody who said, I need to borrow your donkey. I'm going to send my guys to get it. They'll just tell you I need it. That's how you'll know they're not stealing it, right? And so Jesus was very intentional about how he entered Jerusalem. He was very intentional about how he entered Jerusalem because he knew what was going on. And we'll talk about how we know he knew in just a minute. But Jesus is aware, as he goes into Jerusalem, that he is hurtling toward his agonizing death. And he goes anyways. Because he knows the good that it is. So, and once we realize that Jesus knows what he's walking into, still lays out every detail so it can happen exactly the way it needs to happen, then this thing where he's riding a donkey into Jerusalem and all these people around him are celebrating, shouting hosannas, declaring him king. And he knows that he's going to his death. It creates this dramatic tension. Like in literature, dramatic tension is when the audience knows something that the character in the story doesn't know. Right? So it's like we know the person is hiding behind the door. Don't go behind that door. That's dramatic tension. And so this is not exactly the same thing. Don't call my English teacher. But it's a thing where what's happening is Jesus has information or knowledge that the people around him don't have. And so he's in this moment that is celebratory, that for him, I have to imagine is mournful. And it's this weird thing where he's having to if I were him, I'd be like, everybody shut up, please. You're going to call for my head in 5 days. Just stop. That's what I would want to say. Right? But that's not the way it's supposed to happen. So he moves forward into what is hard but good. If we back up, in each of the last 3 chapters before Mark chapter 11, Jesus gives a forecast of his coming death. So Mark chapter 8, verse 31, these are going to be quick. If you're a person who's really fastidious, you might stick with me, or else just trust me that I'm reading the Bible. Mark chapter 8, verse 31. He then began to teach them. So in these passages, Jesus and the disciples are traveling toward Jerusalem. There's a reason for them to be in Jerusalem. It's the Passover festival. So lots of Jews are traveling to Jerusalem. The only thing is, the last time or a couple of times Jesus has been in Jerusalem, the Pharisees there have tried to mount an attack against him. So they know people are out to get him. And so they've actually been kind of avoiding Jerusalem a little bit. And sometimes his disciples tell him, why would we go there? You know they're trying to hurt you. And yet, he's traveling straight toward Jerusalem. Okay? And so these stories, as they're traveling, he's teaching his disciples. And so it says this, 8:31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So Peter, his most audacious disciple, is kind of how he's caricatured, takes Jesus aside and Jesus says very plainly, I'm going to be betrayed by the chief priests and the elders, I'm going to die, and then I'm going to rise again. And Peter takes him aside like, Jesus, what are you talking about? Quit talking about this stuff. That's not going to happen. You're the king. And Jesus ends up saying to him, get behind me, Satan, is what he says to Peter. He recognizes Peter's words as a temptation away from what he's called to do. And then he tells the disciples, then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So he immediately says, hey, look, this is hard, right? Take up your cross doesn't mean you have to be crucified by Roman authorities like he was. It means you do the hard thing that's yours to do. And so first time, Mark chapter 8, he says, I'm going to be betrayed by the chief priests and the elders. I'm going to die and rise again. Peter says, no way, you're the king. No way that could happen. That seems too hard. Surely there's an easier way. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. If you want to follow me, you've got to take up your cross and do the hard thing. Right? That's the first one. Second one, Mark chapter 9, verse 30. Mark chapter 9, verse 30. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. So now it's privately. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. Okay? So they're like, what is he talking about? I don't know. I'm not asking. That sounds weird, right? Or scary, or I don't want to talk about it anymore. And actually what they go on, they're just afraid to ask. And what follows in that text is he tells them that the first must be last. Right? The first must be last. And then he pulls a child from the side. They're like in a house. And he grabs a kid. He's like, you got to be like this kid if you want to be a part of the kingdom. You have to be like a child. Which is like, that's low status. Right? You got to take low status. So again, he tells them again, privately, they are weirded out, don't know what to think, and they're afraid to ask. And then he teaches them about the kingdom, first must be last. Okay? Last one, Mark chapter 10, starting at verse 32. They were on their way up to Jerusalem, and with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." Now, you might be wondering why he's talking in the third person, because he's using language from Old Testament prophecy to talk about himself. Okay? So the Son of Man is language from the book of Daniel about the coming Messiah, and so Jesus often uses this title to talk about himself. So he's saying to them, and they've heard him refer to himself as the Son of Man before, and so he's saying to them again, we're going to go to Jerusalem, going to be betrayed by the teachers of the law, condemn me and hand me over to the Gentiles, who will mock me, spit on me, flog me, and kill me. 3 days later, I will rise. I'll just read this because it's funny. "Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want you to do for us whatever we ask.' 'What do you want me to do for you?' he asked. They replied, 'Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other on your left in your glory.'" And they don't get it. They don't get it. There's a way of speaking about the crucifixion of Jesus where it's his coronation ceremony. I mean, literally, they put a crown on his head as he's crucified. Jesus being raised up on a cross is a part of Jesus' glorification. And James and John just said, "Can we sit at your right hand and your left in your glory?" And he says to them, "You don't know what you're asking." He says, you can't. Like, you are not able to do that. And then he tells them those spots are already reserved for other people. There's a couple of ways to think about that. Like, one of them is for the two criminals who were crucified on Jesus' right and his left. The other one could be for Moses and Elijah in the heavenlies. But the point is, they don't get it. You don't know what you're asking. And then he goes on to tell the disciples, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. So again, as Jesus enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and people are chanting that he is the king, the long-awaited one, they're saying, "Hosanna in the highest." The disciples, first of all, Jesus knows exactly what's going on. He's been talking about it for 3 chapters, which is, weeks, right? He knows exactly what's going on. We know that. And the disciples have no idea. Because to them, the idea that he would march into certain death is like, no, dude. You do miracles. You're the Messiah. There's an easier way. It doesn't have to be this hard. That's what Peter's saying to him when Jesus rebukes him. It's like, no. What you're talking crazy talk, Jesus. You don't have to submit to anybody. Nobody could kill you. And again, James and John come to him and he says, "I'm going to die." And they're like, "Hey, cool. Can we sit next to you in your glory? We want to rule alongside of you." They don't get it. They think the call of the Messiah is to rule over others, and that's why he immediately says to them, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. I am being made low." They can't imagine it. The disciples can't imagine it because it seems too hard. It doesn't make sense to them. Why wouldn't he just do it an easier way? Why wouldn't he just rule over the earth in some way that is easier? And notice, every time the disciples dispute Jesus' claim that he's going to die or resist Jesus' claim that he's going to die, what Jesus does is begin to tell them something about the kingdom. So, first one, Peter says, "No way, Jesus." And then Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." And then he tells them, if you're going to follow me, you must take up your cross. So what he's saying is in the kingdom, we all have some kind of responsibility to bear, right? I don't think the crosses that we bear are always suffering, but they are always hard but good. Hard but good, right? Then they're afraid to ask him about it, and they don't understand. And he tells them, the first must be last. If you want to be a part of what I'm doing, the first must be last, and the last must be first. Be like the child who is the last, because that's who's first in the kingdom. And then James and John ask to sit with him in his glory, and he says, you don't know what you're asking. I came not to be served, but to serve. My kingdom is a kingdom where the king serves. My reign, my domain is a place where the king serves. Every time they can't figure it out, Jesus begins to point them to the kingdom. And so here we are, back at Palm Sunday, Jesus riding a donkey into town, people laying cloaks and palm branches to create a red carpet for him. And they're shouting, Hosanna to the King, glory to your name. Like they're shouting praises on Jesus. Everyone is unsuspecting. Like that dramatic tension moment where Jesus knows what's going on, but they don't. That's because they cannot imagine a reality where somebody like Jesus has to die. Because to them, in the moment, Jesus seems like hope and power and goodness. And they're like, no, this is our chance. We're about to be delivered. But Jesus presses on with what is his to do because his reality rests in the kingdom. And this is the thing. Jesus takes up the posture of a servant, takes up the cause of the outcast. We'll see this in the next couple of days of Holy Week, the next couple of weeks of our preaching. Jesus takes up the cause of the marginalized. He confronts the religious powers because the kingdom is turning everything over. And what happens in the ensuing days is that the powers of the world, the people who run the temples and the religions and the governments and the taxes, cannot have someone like Jesus showing that you can give away your power and become less. It does not work in the world that we have created for ourselves, and therefore Jesus is rejected. So Jesus is living a kingdom reality while everyone around him is living an earthly reality, and so the earth rejects him. The people of the earth reject him. But Jesus presses on because with his reality resting in the kingdom, not being dominated by earthly concerns, his reality rests in the kingdom, and therefore he knows the way through death into life. He knows the full meaning of hard but good. And so then that's what I imagine. That's where I imagine Jesus on Palm Sunday and in the days that follow as he's marching toward his own death. It feels hard. And in fact, on Thursday, he prays a prayer to his heavenly Father and says, if there's any way for me to get out of this, I'll take it. Not literally, he says, if there's any way this cup may be taken from me, right? If there's any way I can get out of this, I'll take it. So he's saying, I would rather be anywhere else. And then in the next breath, but not my will, but yours be done. So I would rather be anywhere else. And there's nowhere else I'd rather be. I mean, what a beautiful, beautiful conviction. That Jesus is tied to a reality and a truth that is so compelling and so good that it would actually take him into and through death. Because he knows the goodness of the kingdom. So here's the question for us today is like, what are you willing to do even though it's hard? What's the conviction you hold about what's good that pulls you through the hard? What are you willing to endure? What is the thing that gives you endurance? There's a term that is sometimes used for the Holy Week narrative. It's the Passion. There's a movie, The Passion of Christ, right? But for a long time, this Holy Week narrative from Palm Sunday to Good Friday to Easter is referred to as the Passion. And that word passion is it's like deep, deep feeling. That's the hard but good. That's passion. And what we find in Jesus is that the depth, the meaning, the purpose, the reality, the hard but good is available when we allow the Spirit of God to make us one with the kingdom of Jesus. We discover that the conviction of the depth and the meaning and the purpose and the reality of the kingdom can be the thing that gives passion to everything that we do. Amen? Amen.